Hey everyone, welcome back to Mystic Mythos, a collection of stories. And today, episode 4, I'm going to call My Story Part 2. So I went back and I listened to the first part of my story and made some notes about where I could be a little bit more clear and offer some more insight into kind of what I went through and what I learned from it. So to recap, I talked a little bit about some of the challenges of growing up in a home where my family was kind of dysfunctional and there was a lot of struggles, including my parents being involved with drugs and alcohol. I also spoke a little bit about my mom's first husband being arrested and some of the ways that that was explained to me as a child, which as an adult I've learned were not true. So that was the first part. And then I also explained some of the abuse and things that I went through as a child. So if you haven't listened to that first episode, I would suggest going back and listening to it when you have time, just because it'll make things make a little bit more sense. So some of the things that I made notes about that I kind of want to make sure I cover again and maybe offer a little bit more clarity on was setting boundaries with my biological dad when I was 16. When I went to his house and left him the note saying, if you don't want to be a part of my life, I'm going to stop trying. He didn't contact me again until last summer when my half-sister on his side reached out to me and we connected with each other. He tried to message me again then, and that's, I believe it was about 20 years difference. So clearly that is still going to be kind of a sticking point. One thing I didn't mention in the last episode was that I grew up as a ginger. I have had red hair since I was quite little. I was born blonde, but when my hair all came in, it was red. And that was a source of some bullying when I was younger. I always loved it. I always thought how unique and how great it was to be somebody different than everybody else, but everybody doesn't necessarily see that the same way. So that was kind of a source of some pain. I did talk a little bit about the memory of sexual assault that happened at the age of 5 and how it came back to me after I had done several months of therapy. It's when I was working on EMDR and that started coming through. It was really hard. In the last episode, I said that I thought I would probably be angry about it forever. That's not necessarily true. I feel like I have processed that. It's been about a month since the last episode came out. So I am a little bit behind just because I've had some stuff happening in my real life, which I'll talk about a little bit. But it's been about a month since that episode came out, and I feel like I have made my peace with that memory, which is great because it means that it's not something that is popping up in my day-to-day life anymore, which is always a good thing. That's a good sign that things are starting to mend and it's not going to continue to be a problem for me. One more thing that I wanted to elaborate on was asking in prayer at 14 to be the cycle breaker in my family. I mentioned that in last episode, and in a sense, I think that that was kind of successful, but it also was unsuccessful. So let me explain what I mean. I say unsuccessful because I have 2 sisters on my mom's side and the one sister on my dad's side, and we all have been through some pretty similar abuse cycles. And I think in a way, like I was not able to break that cycle, which is not necessarily my responsibility as a sister. I have tried to be there for my siblings to help them through it. So that's where I say, like, it kind of was successful, but it kind of wasn't, because they did experience some of the same things that I went through, but it was successful in the sense that I was able to be there to support them and help them get through it and offer them some ideas of things that might help them process some of this stuff a little bit better. So we still, all of the women in my family have, some trauma that hangs out, but it was successful in the sense that I have not passed that trauma on to my children. I made some adjustments in my parenting pretty early on to make sure that they were aware of things that were not okay. We talked a lot about how you protect your body and how you protect yourself from people who are not doing things in your best interest. We've had a lot of conversations about that, especially as my kids have gotten older. And I've tried to always be an open book where they can come to me with questions and we can talk about any of these things. I know that I'm not always successful in that. Sometimes I don't respond the way that I would like to. Sometimes I react. And that's something that I'm still working on. And that kind of comes along with unraveling some of this stuff just because it's very deeply a part of your life, especially if you grow up in that kind of an environment. So I'm still working on those things, but it'll change with time. Those things always do, as long as you keep working on it. The next thing that I really want to cover is anxiety, because my mother is an anxious person and I am an anxious person. And I want to talk a little bit about that just because a lot of people have anxiety show up in their life in different ways. And I can go through how it shows up for me. And if you're experiencing any of these similar symptoms, I guess, then you might want to look into this and see if you potentially are experiencing anxiety as well. So for me, the symptoms come with increased heart rate. My blood pressure goes up. I have a tendency to react instead of respond. I try really hard to respond to things instead, which involves like taking a pause, making sure that you are listening to the other person, but also listening to yourself and remaining true to who you are. Reacting is just like your knee-jerk response. And I try to avoid that as much as I can. Sometimes it's hard. Like if I am feeling anxious or if I'm experiencing symptoms of anxiety, it's a lot harder for me to pause and do what I would like to do to respond. But practice makes you better at it. Some of the other symptoms that I have experienced is feeling panic. Sometimes my hands will go numb. They'll get cold and then they'll go numb. And that usually is accompanied by an increased heart rate. So the feeling of panic, that's how that shows up for me, is I can feel my heart rate get faster and my hands get cold, and then my hands and my arms start to go numb. And that's a really severe reaction for me. It takes a lot for me to get to that point. But I know that when I get to that point that a panic attack is coming. When I notice that, I try to get myself to a place where I can just put myself in a bubble, pretty much. Like I'll put headphones in and I'll do some breath work and try to center myself so that it doesn't become like a full-blown panic attack, because that's not fun. I've had it happen a couple of times. One time I was at work and it happened, and I thought I was having a heart attack because my arms went numb. That was, I think I was probably 23 when that happened, and that was the first one that I ever experienced. I have also had it happen at work multiple times at other jobs, and one of them, it was happening so frequently that I had to go on medication for it. So those are all the ways that I have it show up in my life. I can tell that I'm anxious if I start picking at things, which is really funny because my daughter does the same thing. So anxiety kind of shows up for her in the same way that it does for me. Another subject that I want to make sure that I cover is depression, because I do mention that in the previous episode. I talked a little bit about some suicidal ideation. I talked a little bit about attempting to take my own life. I talked about feeling depression and not feeling safe in my body. And that's a really weird feeling, to not feel safe in your body. I don't know really how to describe that one, but if you've ever felt it, just know that you're not alone. There's a lot of people who do feel this at one point or another in their life. I have learned that the depression generally is brought on by anxiety that goes for a long time unchecked. So if I've been experiencing anxiety pretty regular and I have not done what I can to take care of that, which is like putting myself in that bubble and grounding myself and just recentering. If I don't do that and I let it continue, it kind of steamrolls into depression. So the biggest thing that I have been able to do that helps with this is to recognize burnout when it's happening. And what I mean by that is overcommitting to things or not saying no when I don't want to do something. So saying yes when I really mean no. That almost always leads me to burnout. Trying to do too much, putting too much on my plate, that will lead me to burnout. Not giving people appropriate timelines for things leads me to burnout. So knowing those things about myself makes it a lot easier for me to plan to not reach that point. And what I mean by that is I try to recognize those symptoms as they come up and know that that's what that is, and then give myself enough time to complete tasks and things that I need to do. So if at work, if somebody were to say, hey, can you do this thing for me? I will try to set an appropriate timeline. So if I have a lot of things already on my plate, I'll tell them yes, but it will probably be tomorrow or the next day before I can get to it. And if you need it faster, you're going to have to ask someone else. And sometimes that can be really hard to do, especially if you're working in an industry that's high demand. And I've talked about that before, working in the print industry and the design industry, because I worked in that field for a long time. And it is pretty high demand. There's a lot that's required of you. There's a lot of deadlines. And anytime that you're working with deadlines, there is potential for anxiety with that, especially if you're prone to it already. So I think working in that industry was really important for me. It taught me how to recognize these things. And it also taught me how to set appropriate boundaries for other people in my work environment and for myself. Because without those, like, you tend to overcommit to a lot of things. And then, if you're not meeting those commitments, then it just adds to that. So it's kind of like, it just kind of steamrolls together, because you start off by saying, oh yeah, I can do that, and not realizing that you already have so much on your plate. And then you're trying to add one more thing. And sometimes that can be the thing that pushes you over the edge. And that's where depression starts to come in, because you have committed to do these things. And for me, like, when I commit to something, I really don't like not fulfilling that. I really like to be able to follow through on a commitment. It's really hard for me if I can't. So if I commit to something and then I can't do it, then that negative self-talk starts. That's where it comes in. It's like, oh, you're so this or that, or, you never complete these things on time, or you always fail, or, any of those things. And anytime that you hear the word always or never from your self-talk, you need to pause and recognize that that's not true. Because as a person, for the most part, I follow through on everything. And if I have to adjust expectations, I do that. So that's kind of another red flag to watch out for, especially in that self-talk. And that's hard. That's hard to do. And I recognize that. But this is how this has been for me. So depression kind of comes from all of those things. Not feeling safe in my body felt a lot like distrust. And it's weird because it was distrust to myself, meaning that I didn't feel safe being alone. I had a lot of really intrusive thoughts, which is, if you don't know what that is, it's when you're carrying out like a normal daily task and a really negative thought pops up in your head. So, for instance, you're driving and you have a thought pop up in your head, like, what if my tire blows out and my car goes off into a field and it rolls and I get ejected from my car? Like, that's an intrusive thought. And I didn't know that a lot of people have those. I always thought that it was just me. So when those would start, I was a little bit freaked out by that. But going through therapy, I've learned that it's pretty common. A lot of people experience that. So if you are experiencing that, just know that is a pretty common thing. And it's okay that it's happening, but you need to make sure that you are not listening to those thoughts. Make sure that you're evaluating what they mean. And if you're hearing them like physically, then you should probably speak to a professional and make sure that it's not symptoms of something else. Another symptom that I have that comes up, especially if I leave the anxiety unchecked for a long time, is insomnia. And insomnia comes along with the burnout feeling. The burnout feeling usually contributes to it, I think, because insomnia for me is not being able to turn off my mind and having it just go and go and go in the background. And when that's just going all of the time, then it's really hard to go to sleep because you give those thoughts a space and let them run, you know? So that is another symptom that I have experienced quite a bit. And I noticed that it kind of came in waves. So I would experience it a lot in the spring months, usually around March or April. And it would be about a week long. And then I would experience it again around the change of the seasons from fall to winter, just depending on when that really started to happen. And I know now, after going through years of therapy, that some of it for that transition from fall to winter was probably in anticipation of November, December. Those 2 months have always been really hard for me because some of the worst things that have happened to me have happened during those months. And it's shown up pretty consistently around that time period. So I think that they're connected. I'm not 100% sure because I'm not a professional, so I can't really speak to that. But in my mind, it makes sense that they would be linked with each other. The next thing that I want to talk about is some of the coping mechanisms. So I mentioned that I overcommitted myself a lot when I was in high school, and that was just so I didn't have to go home. What I did not mention is that I was drinking alcohol. I started that at 14. Trying to cope, just trying to numb some of the feelings that I was feeling because everything was so intense all the time. I was definitely experiencing some anxiety at that point. I had some pretty difficult symptoms of that, but I didn't know what it was. And because I left it unchecked, it did eventually spiral into depression. So it was a really weird combination of events that led to that. I did try smoking marijuana. I did also take prescription pills, and these were all some of the coping mechanisms that I used to try to numb what I was feeling. I didn't realize that what I was feeling was actually anxiety, and that it was something that there are a lot of really great tools out there to help you cope with that. So I know that now, and I will put links to some of the things that I find helpful in the show notes so that you guys will have access to it as well. But these are the biggest coping mechanisms that I used when I was in high school. And it took me a long time to see that it wasn't working because it got worse and worse, right? So anybody who has experienced addiction of any kind, anybody who has ever tried self-medicating, anybody who's been through this knows that it starts out low and you start out, with just a little bit to try to help you cope. And then as it goes on, you need more. And then you need more than that. And then you need more than the last time to get the same feeling and to be able to numb yourself so you don't have to feel anything. And that got a little bit dangerous and definitely got scary. I remember a couple of times having an experience where I was like, this is not safe for me. And it's interesting that I had that feeling because I didn't want to feel anything, but part of me was like, I have to stop. I didn't actually want to stop until I met my husband. And when we were just friends and we were just talking, it was something that allowed me to have a space where I could just exist. And I didn't have to be anything, and I didn't have to do anything. I could just be who I was and relax. And he just radically accepted whoever I was. So that's why our story kind of became a part of my story, because him being able to honor who I was at that moment was exactly what I needed. And I think that is the thing that allowed me to make the changes that I needed to make. So I want to talk a little bit about resentment and how that affected my life. I can say now that I don't carry resentment with me. I have learned that it is pretty destructive just because I carried a lot of resentment for a lot of years. And now that I don't have it, it's really hard for me to remember what it felt like to carry it with me. But I remember it was a feeling of being overburdened, and I just felt tired because I was always investing my energy into whatever the resentment was. And now that I don't do that anymore, it's interesting how you're able to reallocate that energy to something else. I'm pretty sure that I knew that my husband was the one the night that I met him. I don't know about him, and I'm going to have to ask him. I want to have him on an episode in the future just because he has a very interesting story as well. But we have talked about it a little bit, and I think I knew, and I don't think I wanted to recognize that because, like I said in the last episode, I never had plans to have a family. I never had plans to get married. I was going to be married to my job because that was easy for me, and I didn't have to rely on anyone else. And the thought of relying on another human when other humans have been so unkind and so hard to trust in my life, like that kind of makes sense. I didn't want to have to rely on someone else. I wanted to be able to control the whole situation. And that kind of comes from being out of control as a young person. Lately, I've been feeling more and more like he and I must have known each other in a past life, because the way that it felt the night that I met him was so different from any other person I had ever met. It was like my soul knew who he was. And there wasn't any obligation between us in the beginning. We were just friends. Like I said last episode, we spent a lot of time talking and just being friends with each other and forging a really strong friendship. Like I said, he was going through a divorce and I was dating somebody else at the time, but we just became such good friends, and naturally my relationship dissolved and his marriage was over. I think it just kind of naturally transitioned into what it is now. But in the beginning, things were not easy for us. Number one, because I had no idea how to just be a normal human being. And I say normal as a loose term because I realize that none of us really are. But I remember feeling torn a lot and struggling with it because I had this idea of what my life was supposed to be and all these plans of what I wanted to do. And like I mentioned before, I am a planner. That's what I do. I grew up with chaos, and so I do my best to try to avoid it in the future by planning things. It's usually a loose plan. I don't like to stick to anything too rigid. I like to still be able to be spontaneous if I want to. I just don't want to very often. My daughter gives me crap about that. She told me the other day that I'm never spontaneous, and it's pretty true. I'm not very spontaneous, but sometimes I like to just be like, you know what, let's just go do a thing, like let's just hop in the car and go somewhere. Let's just do something like that. And some of that comes from growing up with my stepdad later on in my life, because he was that way. He would have a day off of work, and we didn't have anything going on as a family. So we would load everybody up in the car and just drive, just pick a direction and go. And we would spend the whole day on the road and drive around. And I mean, we went to national parks. We went and, found petrified wood. We drove all over the state. We spent a lot of time together in the car. And that's where some of the best conversations happened for me when I was young. So I like that kind of a thing. I would love to be able to just throw my kids in a car and drive somewhere and go, fish for the day or something. But it's a lot harder to do than my dad made it seem. When everybody has their own schedule and we're all trying to do different things, it makes it difficult. Another thing that I have found that was really helpful was in 2019, I looked up my astrology birth chart. And looking at some of that information can be overwhelming, and not all of it tracks all the time. Some of it didn't make sense to me then. But as I have gotten older, I have started to see some of those things more in my life. And maybe it's, you could also argue that it's confirmation bias, that now that I know about it, I'm steering my life in that direction. Either way, it's been beneficial and it's been a good thing for me. So you can look into that if that is interesting to you. I also did my human design chart, which is another chart that requires your birth date and time and location. And it combines a couple of different belief systems to create a comprehensive chart. And the more that I dig into that, the more I find that it suits me pretty well. It explains some of the frustration points for me when I was young, and it shows some of the pain points. One of them being that my heart is undefined. And if you are in that world of human design, you'll know that an undefined center generally means conflict, but it also is where your superpowers lie. And everything that I do in my life goes through my heart center. So it either leads me to frustration or it becomes a superpower. So I'm still learning some about that. It's pretty interesting. They say that it takes 7 years to decondition from what you grew up as with human design. So that's a long-term project that I'll have to come back later and talk about, I guess. But currently, it's been very eye-opening and it's been an interesting experience. I feel like it's helped me understand myself, which is something that I struggled a lot with as a child. Even as a young person, like a young adult, I really struggled with that. But it's nice to feel like I understand that now. In 2019, I also bought my first tarot deck, and I was hesitant to do it. I grew up in a traditional Christian community, and according to a lot of their beliefs, tarot is satanic, or it's, occult, and you're not supposed to do it because it invites evil things into your world. But thus far, I have yet to see that happen. I've been doing that since 2019, which is 2 years ago, and I feel like it has given me some focus. So I've been able to focus on different things, and I've used it to help me set an intention for my day. So what I do is I'll draw 3 cards and look at the meanings and how they correlate with each other, and then make a decision of how I'm going to put those to use for the day. And it really kind of started as that. But the more that I did it, the more intuitive I got with it. And now it's to a point that for about the last year, I've been doing readings for other people, and I'm finding that I can feel what the message is supposed to be. And I don't know how much stock I'm willing to put into tarot cards, like the 78th factorial shows that it's pretty unlikely that you're going to draw the same cards. But I've done readings where I've drawn the same cards over and over again. And so it is one of those anomalies that I can't explain, that I don't fully understand. but my gut says yes, so I'm going with that. I did pull cards for myself every day before I decided to pull cards for another person. It's something that even still I'm like, I don't know. I don't know how much I'm willing to say yes, like 100%. This is a message from source or the universe or whatever you want to believe in. But it is oddly consistent with whatever is going on in someone's life. And maybe it is just something that allows you a different perspective on something, in which case, most of the time, it's good. It's a good tool, and it just gives you something else to focus on, or, like I said before, a little bit of a different perspective. I also got an Oracle deck, and I think Oracle probably is easier to start with just because all of the meaning is usually on the card. It's usually one simple, concise message. Tarot has multiples, and depending on what spread you pull, the meaning is a little bit different. So there's a lot more that goes into that. It's more of a time investment and an energy investment. In 2020, I wanted to reconnect with some of my heritage, and that was after finding out who my family was and where I came from through my DNA test. And I knew that my mom's family came from Ireland. So I started looking at what the traditional Irish beliefs were and following the Celtic Wheel of the Year, which starts actually on Halloween, or the Celtic would call Samhain. So we didn't really celebrate that one because when I found this, I was a little bit past that time point. The belief is that on Halloween, the veil between the worlds is so thin that your ancestors are able to contact you, which I think is kind of cool. I mean, obviously, it could be dangerous. Anything can be dangerous, but I think that it's really interesting to be able to pick a day where you honor those people who went before you, and you pay homage to where you're from. And it's very similar in a lot of ways to like Dia de los Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead practiced by the Spanish traditions. It's got a lot of the same traditional beliefs and things, and that's pretty interesting. So that year we actually started with Yule, and we made a Yule log and we put it in the fire. And I misspoke earlier when I said that it was 2020 that I started doing that, and it was after my DNA test because my DNA test was December of that year. So I kind of started looking at some of this stuff as I was toying with the idea of getting a kit, and then my husband got the kit for me that Christmas. So it all kind of happened within a very short time period, and it's hard to keep track of. But we did start following that, and I started learning about herbalism in a way to honor my mother's mother. She passed away, I guess it was 2008, so 13 years ago. She got pancreatic cancer, and she passed away about a month after she was diagnosed with it. I didn't get a lot of opportunities, like I said in the last episode, to sit down and ask her questions or learn from her. This was something that happened much later in my life when I started to connect with all of this. So it's been a really interesting thing, but I appreciate her presence in my life so much more now than I think that I would have then. And in a way, that's kind of sad, but I feel like I've learned so much about her as an individual doing this work. Another thing that I want to touch on and clarify a little bit was the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. When I was diagnosed with that, I was 19. It was right after I'd had my daughter, and I had postpartum depression with her, really, really bad. I was a little bit nervous about being a parent, obviously, because I had always thought that I would not be a parent, but I also knew that sometimes God has bigger plans for you, or the universe, or whatever you believe in. So when I brought her home, I held her in my arms and I fell asleep with her in my arms. And that scared me. And then after that, I was so afraid to hold her. And I was so afraid to connect with her. I think it's because my connection with my mom was never really strong. At that point in my life, my mom and I were not on speaking terms. I didn't really have the option to reach out to her because we weren't speaking. And it was really hard for me because I didn't know how to be a parent. Because all of the examples of parents that I'd had were either short term or had negative sides to them. And I realize now, looking back on that, that trying to measure with absolutes is what led me to being disappointed. I know that sounds kind of weird, but I definitely did put my mom kind of on a pedestal, and I was like, oh, like society tells you that she's supposed to be all of these things, and measuring her against that, she was always falling short because she's a human being and she had her own trauma and she had her own stuff she was dealing with. But society doesn't tell you that when you're young. So I just always felt like she never measured up. And how could I possibly measure up against all of these parameters that I was measuring people by? It wasn't until I had started EMDR that I really was like, oh my gosh, I have to fix this relationship with my mom. I started reading It Didn't Start With You, which is about generational trauma and how some of that stuff gets passed down. It's an excellent read. I do wish that it had a little bit more action points to it, like more work I could do to fix this. But some of it I think you just have to feel out and figure out on your own. So I started having these memories of her come back to me when I was doing EMDR. And most of them were really good memories. I had blocked all of this stuff out because I thought that, all that time I was like, oh, she was just not a good parent. And it makes me sad that I felt that way for so long because she really was a pretty good mom. And that's why I said in the last episode, I don't really hold this stuff against her anymore because I see that she's a human being and I see that she had her own stuff she was trying to deal with. Like I said earlier, we have some generational patterns in the females in my family, and she is no exception. So knowing now as an adult that she was dealing with really difficult things, just like the rest of us, I've been able to look at her as just another human being, and that has changed everything for me. It's made it so that I can be supportive of her and be there for her and not have the same triggers that I had in the past with our relationship. And I also have learned not to take on her anxiety as my own. And that's a difficult thing to learn, but with practice, you can definitely do it. The last couple of months have been really crazy. I have been trying really hard to get in here to record this episode. And I really appreciate everybody who has supported the podcast so far and just kind of stuck with it because there were some challenges that came up with this. One of them being that it was the year anniversary of losing my mother-in-law. I was her caregiver for 9 years. We had her living in our home with us, and that hit me a lot harder than I expected it to. I have done really well dealing with the grief of losing her, and I definitely have made my peace with her not being here, but emotionally it's still a very difficult thing to navigate just because it's still that first year of doing things without her here. The other challenge that I had was, as a mother, realizing that my kids are getting older, which I realize is something that people could laugh at. My daughter started college this year, and my son is in his last year before high school. So I was having a realization that they don't need me as much as they have in the past. But it felt a lot like they don't need me at all. And I definitely had a couple of nights that I ugly cried about this because I was sad. I wasn't ready to move on and have them not need me. I wasn't ready for them to not want to spend time with me. My son's birthday just happened last week, and I was excited because I was like, oh, we get to spend time together. And this was made abundantly clear to me that he is growing up, because he didn't want to have a party. He didn't want to do anything. He just wanted cake. So I bought ice cream cake, and he wanted to go hang out with his friends. So, it's not about me, but it was hard. It was a hard thing to realize that they're becoming their own people and I don't play as big of a role anymore. And up until this point in my life, it's all I've ever done. So to transition out of that, I don't really know what else to do with myself. I don't really know what I want to do. So I have been picking up different hobbies and trying to fill the time and trying to figure out ways to navigate all of this, because it does have a lot of emotion that comes with it. I also have been trying to navigate my feelings with my dad being in cancer treatment. This is my stepdad. He was diagnosed last November with pancreatic cancer, which is what my grandmother had. And we all panicked a little bit when he got that diagnosis. Luckily, it was stage 2B, which means it's not close enough to any arteries to be inoperable. But the operation is really, really in depth. So he went in and had surgery, I believe it was in July, to remove this. And it is a 6 to 8 hour surgery. And they got about halfway through and his oxygen levels started dropping. So they had to stop the operation. They had to put him on a ventilator. He was in the ICU for a couple of days, and then he went home, and they were trying to figure out why his lungs were not producing the oxygen like they needed to. So they put him with a lung specialist. He had to recover from that first half of the surgery. Basically, what they did is remove the gallbladder and then just stitched him back up. So he had to go through, the recovery of all of that, and he was working with a lung specialist, and then they waited about 6 or 7 weeks, and he was supposed to have surgery again, but he got a head cold, so he had to put it off 2 more weeks. So it was about 2 months later that he finally was able to get in, and that was the middle of August. It was middle to end of August, and they went in and did the second half of the surgery, which is to remove the head of the pancreas and reroute all the ducts and everything. So it's pretty intensive. And like I mentioned in the last episode, anytime that you're doing a surgery that involves anything in the GI tract or the gut at all, like there's a really high potential for infection, just because the nature of all of those organs is to digest and to break things down. So if any of that gets into your system where it shouldn't be, it's really problematic. They put him on a feeding tube and they sent him home. I think it was about 5 days after the surgery. And when he got home, he was so sick from that feeding tube. He just spent like the first 24 hours throwing up. And so my mom had to drive him back up to the hospital, and they put him on an IV feeding and took him home. And that was a little bit better. But then when they came and set him up at the house with the IV feed, it made him sick again. And he told my mom, he's like, you have to get this off of me. And so she did. And he just sat for the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do, because everything was making him so sick. So he slept that night, and he got up the next day, and he went in and he was drinking like a inshore shake. And my mom panicked. She was like, you're not supposed to have solid food, and he said, you know what, it's the only thing that's working. And we went and saw him a couple of days after that, and he is doing really well. He's eating his soft food diet, his liquid diet. He has to be really careful with what he's taking into his body because it can't break it down the way it used to, and he needs to give it time so that it can learn how to do this again with half of the pancreas, basically. So it is quite a process. but he is doing really well. The other thing that has kind of gotten in the way of me being able to record is that we're in the middle of trying to get our roof done on our house and replace our furnace. Our furnace in our house went out 3 times last winter, so we're trying to get that replaced before winter hits again. We don't want to have to we have a wood burning stove in our house, but we don't want to have to use it all winter. So that is all taken care of now. So I feel like life is finally starting to get back to normal a little bit. But things are still kind of crazy. Both of the kids are in school. Hopefully that means that I have a little bit more time that I can start recording more episodes for this podcast. I really want to be able to give you guys content regularly. I know that I've not been able to do that a little bit the last couple of episodes, so I appreciate everybody being understanding and still continuing to support the podcast. If you have questions or if there's a subject you would like me to elaborate a little bit more on or cover, I'm happy to dig in and do some research and look into it. Just send me a message and let me know what you'd like to see here, because at the end of the day, the podcast is kind of about me, but it's also about this community and what everybody here collectively is going through. I want to make sure that I'm bringing interviews and things that are relevant to what everybody is experiencing. So if there's something that you would like to see, or if there's something that I need to cover in more detail, please send me a message and let me know. I am going to be working on getting a couple more interviews scheduled now that I have some more time. Now that I'm not dealing with all of those things, it should be a little bit easier. And like I mentioned earlier, I would like to have my husband come on and you guys can hear his story. It's pretty neat. He sells himself short a lot. He is very humble and unaware of how he affects other people. And at the end of the day, I think that is a very good quality to have as a human being. He doesn't feel like he has anything special about him to share, but he definitely has a very unique story, and there are some very special things about him as an individual, and I feel like you guys will connect with that. So you're welcome to check out the show notes if you'd like to see some more about some of these subjects that I've covered today. I'll make sure that I put links in there for the information that I've covered, and I hope that you guys have a really great 2 weeks until the next episode comes out. Thanks for joining me today, and as always, stay mystical.